Hi everyone, Mrs. Rinker here. So today we're finally moving on from Stalin's flavor of totalitarianism, i.e. communism, and gearing up for a very quick look at World War II. But before we do that, we have to kind of backtrack a little bit and take a closer look at what the rest of the world was doing during this interwar time period from about the years 1919 to about 1936, 1939. So today we're going to focus on the West. Where was the West post World War I? Well, let's start with Europe. Europe did have peace, right? The Treaty of Versailles was officially signed. But with this peace also came some pretty severe punishments for Germany. So if you recall, President Wilson from the US had proposed these great 14 points that if Europe had, accepted all of them, would have created a peace without victory. That was his big picture for this final end to World War I. But France and Britain in particular were not so fond of that and ended up rejecting a majority of those points. So with that came a peace with punishment. Germany in particular, they lost land. They ended up having to pay reparations, essentially giving payments to other European nations for the damage that they caused during the war. And also they were not permitted to keep a standing army. And that was meant to kind of curb any further aggression from Germany in the future. Now, peace is great, right? But in general, Europe was also recovering quite a bit from this long, drawn out war. First of all, they were recovering from the physical devastation of the war. Their land was quite literally torn apart. Remember, this was trench warfare, especially in northern France, where a majority of the trenches were. People had dug these massive ditches and network of ditches into the ground. So the land was really devastated. Now, on top of that, infrastructure was really devastated as well. Buildings were destroyed, burned down, factories had been shut down, bridges, roads, all sorts of things had just been completely torn apart during the 4 years of World War I. Now, also, Europe is struggling economically. Why? War is expensive, and they had just gone through 4 years of it. So most European nations are pretty broke by the end of all of this. And also, their factories are not really able to get up and running right away because they've been destroyed. Okay, so they don't have anything to really fall back on so much during this time period. So Europe in general, economically, not ruined, but not in good shape during this time period. Now, also, we have a lot of new and unstable democracies popping up during this time period. World War I really brought an end to monarchs as a primary government form in Europe during this time. So Germany and Austria, this was their first time without a king or an emperor, and trying to move into a democracy and figure out, all the ins and outs of that. And we know, from our studies of other countries and their path towards democracy, that doesn't always go smoothly, right? It can be a difficult process. Now, even those nations that had a longer history with democratic forms of government, like France and Italy, they were struggling also because there were lots of new parties, communist parties, social parties, and all these new parties had different ideas on how to run the government. So that was causing kind of lots of disagreement within even these more well-established democracies. Now, also, Europe was recovering from devastation in the form of death. You may recall that I referred to this as the lost generation. Why? Because so many people died, right? We had a big gap in our population. About 20 million people died from the war itself, and that's split pretty evenly, half and half, between civilian deaths and military deaths. Now, on top of all of that, right at the very end of the war, a flu epidemic broke out, pandemic actually. Actually, the largest pandemic to date. You may hear it referenced now and again in the news because it was the largest pandemic that the world has ever seen, bigger than the Black Death, bigger than smallpox, really bigger than anything the world had seen before. Around 50 million people died globally from the Spanish flu. So that was a whole nother element that Europe and really the world was recovering from during this post-war time period. So, how is Europe feeling from all of this? Generally, not so great. There is kind of a widespread feeling of despondency, which, like, that's a fancy word of essentially saying kind of hopelessness, not really seeing the bright and the light of the future. And there's also a lot of anger, right? You can understand, obviously, how German citizens would be feeling anger towards maybe their government or towards other nations for the, costs that they're having to bear from the war. But also, people are angry just about all of the loss of the economy, loss of life. And just how long World War One ended up dragging out. So people in Europe are not feeling super happy in these post-war years. Well, when we talk about the West, we don't just talk about Europe. Also, we tend to include the US in that discussion. So let's take a look at the US because they were involved in World War I as well. Well, the US had a short period of economic decline and a little bit of political instability, some rioting that was happening during 1919. But pretty quickly after that, things evened out. And especially economically, things went awesome. Okay. Their economy was booming in the 1920s. Now, there's a few reasons for this. U.S. industries had kind of ramped up during the war effort. Remember, the U.S. didn't bring a lot to World War I in terms of military assets, but what they did have, lots of stuff, which was key to a war of attrition. And it was really our industries, our industrial system that helped provide all of this stuff, agriculture as well. But industries were probably making us the most money, right? So industries were just rolling after World War One. Also, in the 1920s, there were lots of new cool inventions that were making production a lot faster and a lot cheaper. So we were making more stuff for less, right? And at a much quicker rate. So this just helped move things along that much more. Also, in general, there was less competition for US industries. Why? Because all the other major powers, Britain, Belgium, Germany, were still recovering from the war, right? So they couldn't exactly compete with US industries at this point in time. So we were kind of the only man on the field. Now, on top of all of this, remember, Europe's still in recovery. They're trying to build things back up again. And how do they do that? By taking out loans. Guess who is giving them all those loans? US banks, right? And when a bank gives out a loan, it's not just a free thing, right? They're getting something out of that, and that something is interest. So US banks were actually making quite a bit of money off of these loans that they were giving out to European nations as well as European private industries. So all of that combined to make a really thriving economy for the US in the 1920s. Now, not only was the economy thriving, but in general, this was kind of a period of growth for the US. Cities were growing, we were becoming much more urban. Skyscrapers were popping up all over the place. People were becoming more dependent on public transportation, things like that. We saw the growth of subway systems, all sorts of things. Women were also starting to take on more roles outside of the home. Remember, the 19th Amendment was passed in 1919, so they had the right to vote. But on top of just that political power that women were starting to take, they were also just starting to take more control of their lives. More women were working outside of the home, especially before marriage, taking more control over even small things like their personal appearance, cutting their hair short, wearing short skirts, ooh, how risque, and taking control of family planning for many of them the first time, in their lives. Now, on top of all of this, we also, in general, in the US, had a lot more access to new technologies. Remember, our industries were going crazy. We were making all sorts of things. And some of those things were really cool, like cars. Whoa, right? We had Henry Ford, who the innovator of the assembly line, making the first affordable car for for US citizens. And this really changed the way our infrastructure works, right? We started to move away from trains and move towards roads and cars as our main way to get around. Planes became more common, although people aren't taking planes to gallivant around the world. You're starting to kind of hear about them more. People like Amelia Earhart and so on and so forth, doing cool things in planes. Radios are becoming very common. Almost every American will have one or at least access to one nearby by the 1930s. And with this, we're getting all sorts of new entertainment as well as more access to the news, right, to world affairs. And on top of all of that, the 1920s was really the birth of Hollywood, right? Movies had become a big thing, a big industry during this time period. So our entertainment industry was definitely on the rise as well. So it doesn't sound so bad, right? But as you may or may not know, this didn't last forever. And what came next certainly had some impacts for the rest of the world. So as we move on, to looking at our bigger question for the day, which is why was Europe so vulnerable to fascism? I want you to kind of keep in mind some of the things that we've discussed today, not only some of the problems that Europe was facing in the post-World War I economy and society, but also how much they were dependent upon the US during this time period and what that might mean during the 1930s. All right, enough for me. I'd love for you to go complete the assignment that was attached in your classwork today. And we will move on to looking more closely at some of those fascist governments and what they did and how they gained power later on this week. So, bye everyone.